Traveller homelessness is, unfortunately, a growing field of our knowledge and work. So we need to know as much about it as we can, whether that be at national level, at regional level, which we have here, and at local level, which we have here, so that we can construct an effective response to it. I would particularly like to welcome the report from its focus on definitional issues, because that means we know who is homeless and why and how, especially the focus on hidden homelessness. That's an important word, which many of the speakers have emphasized already. The use of the European definition of ethos, which has officially been accepted by the Irish state as a valid approach, and issues of overcrowding. In particular, this report looks at the causes of traveller homelessness and their consequences, with case studies, one of which Breda has just added a very illuminating and distressing one just a moment ago. This report is welcome because it addresses the issues of policy, legislation, resources, and an important R word, rights here, because those, we don't always see them in all reports. And in particular, it highlighted some critical issues such as the choice-based letting system, evictions, and legislation. I've been asked to speak for a moment about the report which was commissioned and published by Harvey, which is the report which you see here on the slide, the Traveller Community and Homelessness. I believe it was one of the first to address the issues of traveller homelessness using those two words together, one of the first to do so. The approach which it took is similar, using a similar method, framework to the Cork and Kerry report. The findings are similar, and in fact, I would consider that there's quite a degree of overlap between the two reports. And I'm going to say a little bit about this report and the conclusions and recommendations, because I know people are quite rightly very impatient that we see action and implementation. I'm just going to put up one table of statistics, but there's really only one figure that I'm going to ask you to look at, and it's on the second bottom line, where you see under travellers, you see the percentage figure 39%, because that is the proportion of travellers who are overcrowded. And if you can compare that to the national figure overall, which is 6%. And these are Central Statistics Office figures, so I think we can consider them reliable, though it would be interesting to see what update we get from the next census due later this year. But it is a very dramatic exposition, I think you would agree, of the very high level of hidden homelessness and overcrowding in the traveller community, which this report quite rightly emphasises. The picture emerging from the report which I wrote drew attention to site conditions as one of the main precipitating events causing traveller homelessness, especially evictions, often carried out by the very local authorities who had responsibility for housing travellers themselves. The report which I wrote looked at the trajectories in and out of sites and homelessness. It was not just a static report looking at figures now, but looking at what happens when travellers become homeless. And it looked at the revolving doors, people going out of sites, getting some accommodation somewhere else, returning back to sites, couch surfing, and living in cars as well. People going round in circles from one precarious situation to another. But above all, unable to get onward accommodation, as Breda's report just, I think, very vividly illustrated. Be that local authority or private rented, the latter because of the high levels of discrimination there, but the local authority shortfall going back to 1987. Those of us working in homelessness at the field warned that if you reduce local authority housing, which had been running at up to 8,000 a year, it was reduced within 2 years to only 700 a year. And in 2015, the local authorities built 75 houses. That's less than 1% of what they had been building when we were a poorer country 20 years earlier. If you do that, if you turn off the tap of local authority accommodation, that is the crisis that we're going to get now. And it's regrettable that people warned of that at that time, but yet it still happened. And also the report, the Pavey Point report, drew attention to the poor experience which travellers had of homeless services, of list culling, taking people off the list without telling them, of social welfare rules, meaning only one caravan, one trailer per certain given square meters of area. The choice-based letting scheme. Frontline services, which could charitably be described as unsympathetic. The lack of onward accommodation, the policy of 2 strikes and out, where often arbitrary and unclear offers were made, but if you didn't accept them, you were off the housing list. Criminality tests. In other words, you were looking at a cumulative pattern of discrimination against the traveller community. And if that discrimination was not explicit, but it often was in private rented, under European law, if you operate administrative systems in such a way that some groups are more affected than others, that is nevertheless discrimination. One particular thing I would like to draw attention to here is that in the area of the traveller community and homelessness, there are 2 different worlds institutionally. Now you might say, what has the institutional architecture got to do with this? It sounds very arcane, very academic, way out there. It actually matters a lot, because if you look at this diagram, you'll see there is one system on the left-hand side for addressing homelessness, one part of the department, one homeless consultative forum, homeless policies around housing first, needs assessment, homeless action plans, waiting lists, allocations, regional consultative forums, and homeless action teams. On the right-hand side, you have the system that is supposed to help travellers with a different unit in the department, a different national traveller accommodation committee, annual traveller counts, traveller accommodation plans, local traveller accommodation committees, about which people have spoken already, different allocation systems and so on, and never the 2 shall meet. How can you address the problem of traveller homelessness when you've got one part of the state dealing with homelessness and the other part of the state dealing with the traveller community? So that is one of the core problems which I think we need to address. This institutional architecture divided between the 2 sees not only these issues as separate, but unrelated. And I think the report which we see this morning shows that these are far from separate and unrelated. They are totally connected. It means the problems of one are not seen or understood on the other. The system of this architecture is often untransparent. It's very difficult to find out how it works. It functions poorly. Many committees, whether they be homeless or traveller committees, have not met for many years. They function intermittently and inadequately. They are state-centric. The state gives itself a very strong role in controlling, in sharing, in putting large numbers of state bodies on these bodies, leaving not a lot of space for travellers or the non-governmental community. And above all, traveller participation in these committees is not given the kind of resourcing, if any, that it should, to ensure that it functions effectively. And these are some of the core problems, which is why the traveller accommodation committees and other instruments are so ineffective. There's no mystery to it. I'm going to come back to these points in a moment, but one of the points raised on page 34 of the report was that issue of housing associations. There are 520 housing associations in this state. Only one of them is exclusively responsible for travellers. This, although others are known to help them, like SONUS and DePaul, but it does mean that the housing association response to the traveller housing crisis is very, very limited. We know from the British experience that if you do invest in it properly, providing the technical assistance necessary to make it work, it will make a much more substantial difference. So what are the ways forward? And I've 2 columns here outlining what I think should be the way forward. First of all, we need independent reports on traveller homelessness of the type that we're looking at the moment, that do give a true and genuine reflection of what is happening, with annual conferences that look at this on a frequent basis and where officials may be held responsible. We've got to address the issue of the 2 different institutional worlds. We need to have travellers mentioned and addressed in the homeless action plans. They're not at the moment, they're often not even mentioned. We need to have homelessness mentioned in the traveller accommodation programs. So those 2 must come together in both these different schemes. We must have the use of proper ethnic identifiers. Many state agencies and many, indeed, even housing associations will not use ethnic identifiers. although they clearly would be a significant help in enabling us to measure more accurately the nature of traveller homelessness. And it needs to be a strand in the Housing First initiative where travellers are not yet currently included. The architecture about which I've spoken a moment ago must be reformed. There must be cross-representation with the two groups represented, the one on the other. There must be transparency, because even finding out these groups was very hard work. So that we must know who they are, where are their secretariats, and so on, so there can be proper involvement in them. There must be parity of esteem with both traveller groups and homeless groups, given the appropriate respect and recognition within them, and not being hopelessly outnumbered by state agencies. These structures must meet and must be made to work. They must be accountable. They must issue reports. They must have the right to issue and publish their own advice without permission from up above. The capacity of traveller groups must be built with Section 10 funding, that's the Housing Act already mentioned, which does provide resources for groups working with homeless people. But so far as I know, no traveller organisations have got Section 10 funding yet. There must be traveller homeless workers who specifically address the problem about which we've spoken this morning, and there must be housing rights workers, because that is a very specific and important part of this problematic. And finally, on proposals, my suggestion is that work be done with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission on the public sector duty, which obliges all public bodies, it's not optional, which obliges all public authorities to observe human rights and non-discrimination. And just finally, the concluding part of the proposal in the report came back to the issue of discrimination. Is there anything that could help us, either geographically or from our past history? Well, actually there is, and it's not more than 100 miles from where I'm sitting, though I grant you it's a bit further to Cork and Kerry, and that's in Belfast. Because when discrimination effectively prevented Catholics in Northern Ireland from getting housing, the British government set up the Cameron Report, which took away the powers from the local authorities and gave them to an independent agency, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, by 1972. Not only that, but it addressed the problem of supply by setting up the Northern Ireland Housing Trust, which comes back to the issue of housing associations I mentioned a moment ago. These were in 1969 and 1945. So it would appear that in this jurisdiction we're lagging about 80 years behind Northern Ireland. Both of these measures worked. Nobody, not even the unionist councils who discriminated against Catholics, would argue that they should return to the old system again now. The Northern Ireland Housing Trust built 48,500 homes, something on the scale of the housing problem that then existed in Northern Ireland. Such proposals, though, have been stoutly resisted here on all kinds of grounds that local authorities wouldn't want their powers taken away and so on. But actually, that's not what matters. What matters is what would be the outcome for travellers, not local authority convenience. So one very concrete outcome was proposed, which was a bill which could be introduced in either the Dáil or Seanad for the transfer of existing powers around housing from local authorities to an independent agency like that set up under the Northern Ireland Act of 1972. With an analogue to the Northern Ireland Housing Trust to ensure traveller access to voluntary and social housing, but this is critical on a sufficient scale to respond to the problem. The Northern Ireland legislation in 1969 to 72 was actually very short. This was not rocket science. It was a very short, simple bill for the transfer of powers, with the suggestion that this could, without a lot of difficulty, be completed in the lifetime of the current Oireachtas, which, as I understand it, runs to 2025.